Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of Office Hours with yours truly, Professor Stephen Asma. As usual, we're doing sort of a deeper dive on the weird, the strange, the wonderful, the sort of an intense study of inexplicabilia, if you will. And today I thought we'd talk about aliens in general, extraterrestrials, and specifically think about how they've been conceived and thought about through cultures, either, as dangerous enemies or as sort of gods or helpers. And it turns out there's long traditions of this. I mean, we've had about 150, maybe 200 years of science fiction aliens. But there's actually much earlier stories. There's even sort of an ancient Roman writer named Lucian, who's sort of living in the 100 to sort of 125 to 180, I think are his dates of the Common Era. And he's talking about creatures or extraterrestrials living in the moon. And so these stories go back to the ancient world. And as we're going to talk about today, they might even be referred to in scriptures and places like the Bible. But the traditions you're familiar with, like H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, very famous, obviously, and there the aliens are not looking out for us. In fact, they want to sort of drink our blood or use our bodies as resources, as food. And more recently, the great Chinese writer Zixin sort of exploded Chinese science fiction in the last decade by writing The Three-Body Problem and sort of a trilogy of books. And that's been turned into, I think, a couple of television shows, most recently a kind of a Netflix series, The Three-Body Problem. And in there, he envisions a sort of a race of alien creatures called the Trisolarians, or the Santi, which sort of means three bodies. They want to come to the Earth. It's going to take them half a century to get here, but they want to basically live on a much more stable planet. So they're going to wipe us out and basically live on the Earth, which is, much more sort of livable than their own world, which is filled with chaos because they have like 3 suns or something. It's a really fun way to think about what does it mean to be human, and what can we expect from our alien encounter or contact. And you might think, well, this is really just science fiction, but in fact, some people are now in risk management journals are thinking and writing about what would it be for us to encounter aliens in a first contact scenario. So it's kind of fun to think about every horror film or every monster story has a kind of threat structure, maybe zombies coming, maybe aliens, and then it has a kind of response structure. How will we fight off the threat and restore security and order? And sometimes the security is provided by the government, but you'll see, like in some fun movies, like think about I think if you look like after World War II, there was a lot of faith in the government. So those wonderful giant insect sci-fi movies of the 50s and 60s all have sort of the government coming to the rescue. But then after Watergate and people stopped sort of respecting the government, or at least there was a lot more skepticism, you got sort of a return of the everyman or the average person. The average man and woman could sort of maybe fight back the threat themselves, and the government might even be part of the problem. You think about Stephen King stories like The Mist, where it's the military and the government have opened up some portal to another nightmarish dimension, but sort of it's everyday people, that maybe have to deal with it. So that threat structure and security is really interesting with regard to aliens too. And one of the things that's interesting is to think, okay, how would the World Trade Organization or the United Nations or the World Health Organization respond to aliens? What would we do in these cases? And so that's why some people are writing about it now in risk management journals and magazines. Okay, so one of the things to think about is, how do we think about a race of beings or a species of beings that are more sophisticated, civilized, and intelligent than we are? We've had interesting sort of meditations on this. If you go back, Francis Bacon writes a book in 1626 called The New Atlantis, and he says, imagine if we go out exploring and we're sort of going through, I don't know, the South Seas or something. We come across an island we've never been to before. And here he's thinking about Europeans traveling and investigating. And you meet, instead of people that are living sort of a kind of a subsistence agrarian lifestyle, you meet people who have, institutions, museums, scientific laboratories. They know more than we do. They're smarter than we are. And so that little novel that he writes in the 1600s influences the formation of all the major European and American scientific societies. People read that novel and they're like, you know what? We should start gathering specimens together into museums and organizing them and creating taxonomies and studying them together so we can build like a sort of a reservoir of knowledge. And another sort of interesting example of this I was thinking about was, you'll know that maybe, the story of how the Roman Empire fell apart is famously told by Edward Gibbon, who's a writer and historian, and he's writing in the 1700s, like around the time of the founding fathers in the U.S., Edward Gibbon is writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He's not thinking about aliens, but he says, what if some different ethnic group comes from a part of the world we're not very familiar with and wants to overtake us, and they're extremely sophisticated. They have amazing weapons. What if we in Europe, he says, end up being, that they want to colonize us? And this is, ironic and amazing because Europe was colonizing every place they went to. And he says, he sort of naively and sort of optimistically says, it's not going to be a problem. It's going to be fine. Because if they have more superior weaponry and technology than we do, that also means they'll be very rational kinds of people. They'll have rationality, and that means that we'll be able to negotiate with them and understand each other, and it's all going to be great. Don't worry about it. I hope he's right if we extend that view to the aliens arriving in their high-tech equipment. Okay, so think about ancient aliens too. This is a theory that's oftentimes trotted out, not always with good evidence, but sometimes, there's some compelling evidence for it. And Carl Sagan thought maybe there could be evidence for it. He writes in one of his books, Intelligent Life in the Universe, he says, I came upon a legend which more nearly fulfills some of our criteria for a genuine contact myth. And this, he's referring to a Babylonian story. There's a Babylonian astronomer, Berosus. He describes a strange species of people called Apkallu, which translates as the wise ones. And they approached the ancient Babylonian people thousands of years earlier from this history. And they were said to be amphibious fishmen. And there's images of this, like you'll see it sort of sculpted and drawn in Babylonian cultural products. And they were amphibious fishmen, and they taught the local people language, and they were, in a sense, a kind of alien that emerged out of the ocean, but actually were beneficial and helpful to human beings. And that's one of the earliest stories that we have that's sort of envisioning sort of what would it be like if we encountered smarter and more creative and intelligent creatures. Obviously, I think in traditional Western religion, angels play this role. All right, so we know that there's a kind of search for extraterrestrial life, and we know that, in 1961, Francis Drake was arguing, that we should be able to find aliens. They should be out there. And in 1966, Carl Sagan was part of this group, and they were writing Intelligent Life in the Universe, books and articles. And in 1985, Carl Sagan writes a book called Contact, and then there's a movie in 1997. And in 1993, NASA cuts the funding for this group. So what are we looking for if we did have a good sort of extraterrestrial search program? We're looking for what's called technosignatures. These are going to be like radio signals or some kind of evidence that there's intelligent life out there. One really sort of compelling idea is that there could be something called a Dyson sphere. And the Dyson sphere is named after a famous physicist, Freeman Dyson, who said it's possible that an advanced civilization would use the power of the sun and create a technology that would harvest that energy and then use it for all the purposes like space travel that they wanted, feeding themselves, everything that this whole species of creature would need to survive, propagate, and then spread through the universe. So we're looking for artifacts on the surfaces of moons and planets. We're looking for heat signatures. We're looking for laser pulses. And it's very common then, I think the most common form of pursuit or search is the listening for signals. So many international radio telescopes are currently being used for radio SETI searches, including low-frequency arrays in Europe, the Murchison Wide Field Array in Australia, and the Lowville Telescope in the United Kingdom. I mean, one of the things that should make us a little nervous is that what if we're projecting signals out into space, and we've been emitting information like electromagnetic waves into space for years. What if these are detected by an advanced civilization and they're not peaceful? And what if they think, well, let's come and see what's going on over here in this part of the world? That is unnerving, and some people have said we should sort of stop sending out signals into space if we can. I don't know how we would do that exactly, but it's an interesting discussion. This leads me to want to think about what would aliens be like? You know, there's a lot of talk about what they would look like, but not a lot of talk about what their minds would be like, and that's super interesting because look how different the minds are down on Earth. Look at animal minds versus human minds. Are things like trees and plants conscious? Most people would say no, but there's a growing group of people that would say maybe they are. We just don't quite understand that form of consciousness. So if you think about the sort of minds that are down here on Earth, you realize there's certain kinds of creatures like cockroaches, and they're basically, they just solve problems by making a lot of themselves and then trying different shit and then hoping it works. Most of them get killed, and then by natural selection, the good ideas sort of get propagated. They go through the population, and you end up having a species that's hardwired with good solutions for like how to eat and where to hide and how to survive. But it's not really a very thoughtful mind. They don't have imaginations. They're not thinking. They're solving their problems entirely by this biology method. And then, like if you go to other kinds of creatures like mammals, like us, and your dog, your cat, those creatures are good at learning through conditioning. So if you sort of, you train your dog to go outside to go to the bathroom, you use a combination of like rewards and punishments. And mammals are really good at that. Would aliens be conditioned creatures like this? And then you have the kinds of creatures like us that can use our imaginations and can actually recreate the world in a virtual space in your mind. Like you can dream, you can imagine what you did yesterday. Lots of animals can't do that. And finally, there's kinds of creatures that can use tools like technology. Even language is a tool because it's a symbol system. Obviously, if an alien, race came to visit us on Earth, they would be very high-level tool users because it takes a tremendous amount of technology to get off your planet and move through, through space. So we're talking about very high-level tool users. But then that's as high as we know of. Is there another level of mind above that where there might be things like telekinesis and teleportation and this is sort of a common, idea among many people, which is that we only have a low functioning mind compared to what might be capable by the mind. And that's an arguable sort of issue. And then would emotions be the same for aliens, or would they not even have emotions? There's sort of a common trope in science fiction, which is emotions can be sort of detrimental and can sort of take you off your game, so to speak. And so you've got androids like Data in Star Trek, or even races of aliens like Mr. Spock that basically have evolved beyond emotions. This is always a really fun idea to me, where it could be possible that a creature would be better off without emotions. And in a way, it's possible that maybe these aliens actually evolve beyond the sort of emotional world that we live in to being more like insects and being more like our cockroaches, just really like survival machines. You see this in the Alien franchise because it's just an amazingly good reproducer with acid for blood, and it gets inside your gut, explodes out of your chest. I mean, it doesn't look like it looks like they're just big insects. And then it's also interesting to think about, well, if they have science, that's amazing, but do they have the same kind of logic we have? Like, do they do logic in the same way that we do? Inductions and deductions and this kind of thing. Are the laws of logic the same for them? That's really interesting to me, like, because we're thinking about that in terms of our development of quantum computing. Old style computers think of zeros and ones, on and off, true and false. But the new quantum computing systems are trying to think in terms of fuzzy logic. Is there a way of thinking between true and false, between on and off, somewhere in these gray areas? And it's possible that alien minds would actually be good at that. And that seems very exciting. So let's think a little bit about this idea of alien as sort of, if not a god, then a kind of angel or a kind of helper. There is a tradition of this. In fact, one of the sort of great ufologists, well, two of them really, sort of promoted this idea. One of them is Jacques Vallée, who writes a book called Passport to Magonia, From Folklore to Flying Saucers, and he writes this in 1969. He argues that humans have been seeing mystical helper creatures, for thousands of years. And just like we saw aliens in the past, I'm sorry, just like we saw angels in the past and fairies, these are in a way sort of versions of superior helpers, and aliens are just the newest version of this. Do they refer to real creatures? Maybe. Are they products of the imagination? Maybe. And another sort of powerful thinker, Carl Jung, out of psychology, argued something similar. He writes a book in 1958, even earlier, called Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. And sort of an argument here could be that normal systems of psychological processes like, hallucinations, you drink too much and you see things, or dreaming, or fantasy interpretations. These are sort of distortions of perception, and they can be sort of voluntary, like you can use your imagination, but they can be involuntary too, where it happens and you don't realize that your mind is actually producing the hallucination. So where are these places? According to these guys, it's possible that there's a kind of aerial cloud land. If you look through folklore, there's a lot of references to a kind of sky land where these creatures might be living, or a parallel universe. So Magonia is a French mythical cloud land, and it's from sort of, it was thought to be where aerial sailors lived, and they would come to Earth and they would steal crops during storms. That's part of French folklore. And then there's a kind of, I think if people know Norse mythology, they know there's a similar kind of elf land. And there's even in the English and Scottish mythology, there's a fairy land. And that's fairly common. Now, what happens? Oftentimes in these stories, people are reportedly taken, just like you see in sort of UFOlogy. Some people talk about alien abduction. Often in these older folklore stories, people are taken. Oftentimes they're returned. And the idea is that they have learned something, or they've received something that's helpful to human beings. And that's really interesting. They also oftentimes, people will report being tested on, and also they'll report a memory loss. And those stories go way back, hundreds of years. I think one of the things that's interesting is, if we go back even thousands of years, there's stories that could be about aliens from the Bible, or other folklore. There's a reference from Ezekiel 1, and I'll just read this very quickly. It says, "I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning, and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze." So that is pretty weird. And it sounds a lot like if you encountered another kind of species and another kind of technology. It could also just be a really active imagination and dream state. There could be references also, I think, in ancient Mayan culture to encounter or contact of some kind. And if you look at Hinduism, for example, too, you find a tremendous amount of fantastical creatures that are reported. And one wonders, somebody was, I've lived on and off in Cambodia and spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. And I was talking to a friend of mine from Cambodia, and he was saying, if you look at all over Southeast Asia, you see these giant snake sculptures. They'll be at the beginning. It's sort of as you enter a temple or downtown in any city or out in the countryside, you'll see these wonderful sculptures and paintings of giant snakes. Sometimes they have multiple heads, but they're huge cobra-like creatures with strange, almost mammal-like faces. And he was saying, like, this is evidence that the aliens came to Cambodia before they came anywhere else. And so this is sort of an attempt on the part of the Khmer culture to sort of represent these alien creatures. And I thought it was fun, and we were sort of having a good time with it. But then I wondered, where do some of these monsters come from? Are they strictly products of the imagination, weaving together different creatures? Or are they referring to something that we no longer have with us now and that may come again? Okay, very quickly here, I just want to talk about a couple of scenarios. What's possible during an alien contact, or rather, what's possible if we consider this idea more broadly? One possibility is there aren't any aliens, and so we're all alone in the universe. But really, most astrobiologists think that's very unlikely. Our galaxy alone has like hundreds of billions of stars, so the likelihood that we're alone it's very unlikely. Most people think that's not the case. But then it starts to get interesting. What if there's life out there, but it's not intelligent? And this strikes me as interesting. I think in most cases, imagine like sort of like bacterial life or viral life or something, populating planets or even whole solar systems. That's not a direct threat to us if there's no civilization or technology, but it is an indirect threat if there's a kind of viral transmission. So what if an asteroid brings some of this to Earth? And we know that stuff like this happens. So that would be a frightening scenario of extraterrestrial life impacting us, but not through technology or intelligence. Another possibility is, what if there's other intelligence out there, but they're not more advanced than we are? Let's say they're equally advanced with us. Well, then we'll both flourish, their civilization and our civilization, and we'll both die out before encountering each other. Like, we'll just never meet each other. That also strikes me as a really interesting thought experiment to think about. The closest star from us is Proxima Centauri, which is a small, low-mass star. It's basically like 4 light years away from the sun in the southern constellation of Centaurus. It would take us about 75,000 years to reach it if you just think about our standard spacecraft kinds of motions. Here's another one. What if they're more technologically advanced, than we are? And that's the one that I think science fiction really loves to play with. So in that case, they're going to visit either as these benign agents, like E.T., or maybe, Ted Chiang's The Arrival. You remember that movie, The Arrival, based on Ted Chiang's great science fiction work, or maybe Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Those are all sort of helpful, possibly good aliens, but it's also possible that they will be unfriendly. And here you just have to think about not just the Alien franchise, but what that seemed to be based on was the Thing from outer space, a great 1950s Howard Hawks film. Just fantastic. If you haven't seen it, you got to see The Thing. Or think about Predator or The Day the Earth Stood Still. These are cases where the encounter is not going to be great. And then this last one that I'm thinking of is really the one that really haunts me personally. And that is that the aliens are not coming. They've already been here, and they may still be here. And here you think about, if you've ever seen the movie Prometheus, it suggests that aliens were here even before the start of life on this planet, and they helped start life on this planet. Or you think about War of the Worlds, where the aliens actually came, hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe millions of years ago, and planted like crafts deep into the Earth's crust, and they're basically just hatching out and causing mayhem. That scenario, I just find that really creepy. There's a little bit of that in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers too, I think. So just to sort of wrap this up, I just want to remind you that, in April of 2022, there was a kind of, this was sort of the result of a Freedom of Information request that a British paper brought against the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. They released 1,500 pages of reports, and the database of documents, it includes UFO-related material from what's called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And this was a secret U.S. program that was looking for, UFOs essentially. And all I'm going to say is the report, it's certainly not over yet, but the report concludes that there is sufficient evidence, quote, to support a hypothesis that some advanced systems are already deployed and opaque to full U.S. understandings, end quote. All right, that creepy ending is, or possibly positive if you take the optimistic view of extraterrestrials. That's the good note to end on. And come back for more office hours, and we'll talk again about inexplicabilia. Wag on, weirdos. Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films, hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein, with additional producing by Mary Chulenza. Original theme music by Luke Top, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Our associate producer is Aidan Brooks. Audio production supervision by Jared Brom and Matt Dyson. Editing and mixing by Jared Brom. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.